The 1965 war witnessed some of the largest tank battles since World War II. At the beginning of the war, the Pakistani army had both a numerical advantage in tanks and better equipment overall. Pakistani armor was largely American-made. It consisted mainly of Patton M47 and M48 tanks, but also included many M4 Sherman tanks, some M24 Chaffee light tanks, and M36 Jackson tank destroyers, equipped with 90mm guns. 110. The bulk of India's tank fleet were older M4 Sherman tanks. Some were upgunned with the French high-velocity CN-75-50 guns, and could hold their own, whilst some older models were still equipped with the inferior 75mm M3L40 gun. Besides the M4 tanks, India fielded the British-made Centurion tank MiG-7, with the 105mm Royal Ordnance L7 gun, and the AMX-13, PT-76, and M3 Stuart light tanks. Pakistan fielded a more significant number and more modern artillery. Its guns outranged those of the Indian artillery, according to Pakistan's Major General T.H. Malik. At the outbreak of war in 1965, Pakistan had about 15 armored cavalry regiments, each with about 45 tanks and 3 squadrons. Besides the Patton, there were about 200 M4 Shermans armed with 76mm guns, 150 M24 Chaffee light tank, and a few independent squadrons of M36B1 tank destroyers. Most of these regiments served in Pakistan's 2 armored divisions, the 1st and 6th Armored Divisions, the latter being in the process of formation. The Indian Army of the time possessed 17 cavalry regiments, and in the 1950s had begun modernizing them by the acquisition of 164 MX-13 light tanks and 188 Centurions. The remainder of the cavalry units were equipped with M4 Shermans and some M3A3 Stuart light tanks. India had only a single armored division, the 1st Black Elephant Armored Division, which consisted of the 17th Horse, the Poona Horse, also called Fakhr Hind, Pride of India, the 4th Horse, Hodson's Horse, the 16th Cavalry, the 7th Light Cavalry, the 2nd Lancers, the 18th Cavalry and the 62nd Cavalry, the 2 first named, being equipped with Centurions. There was also the 2nd Independent Armored Brigade, one of whose 3 regiments, the 3rd Cavalry, was also equipped with Centurions. Despite the qualitative and numerical superiority of Pakistani armor, Pakistan was outfought on the battlefield by India, which made progress into the Lahore-Sialkot sector, whilst halting Pakistan's counter-offensive on Amritsar. They were sometimes employed faultily, such as charging prepared defenses during the defeat of Pakistan's 1st Armored Division at Asaluddar. After India breached the Madhupur Canal on 11 September, the Kem-Karan counter-offensive was halted, affecting Pakistan's strategy substantially. Although India's tank formations experienced some results, India's attack at the Battle of Chawinda, led by its 1st Armored Division and supporting units, was brought to halt by the newly raised 6th Armored Division X-100th Independent Brigade Group in the Chawinda sector. Pakistan claimed that Indians lost 120 tanks at Chawinda, compared to 44 of its own, but later, Indian official sources confirmed India lost only 29 tanks at Chawinda. Neither the Indian nor Pakistani army showed any great facility in the use of armored formations in offensive operations. Whether the Pakistani 1st Armored Division at Asaluddar Battle of Asaluddar or the Indian 1st Armored Division at Chawinda, in contrast, both proved adept with smaller forces in a defensive role, such as India's 2nd Armored Brigade at Asaluddar and Pakistan's 25th Cavalry at Chawinda. The Centurion battle tank, with its 105mm gun and heavy armor, performed better than the overly complex Patton. Naval hostilities. Naval operations did not play a prominent role in the War of 1965. On 7 September, a flotilla of the Pakistan Navy commanded by Commodore S. M. Anwar carried out a bombardment of the Indian Navy's radar station coastal town of Dwarka, which was 320 kilometers 200 mi south of the Pakistani port of Karachi. Operation Dwarka, as it is known, is a significant naval operation of the 1965 war, contested as a nuisance raid by some. The attack on Dwarka led to questions being asked in India's parliament and subsequent post-war modernization and expansion of the Indian Navy, with an increase in budget from Rs. 35 crores to Rs. 115 crores. Indian sources claim that it was not their intention to get into a naval conflict with Pakistan, and wished to restrict the war to a land-based conflict. Covert operations. The Pakistan Army launched numerous covert operations to infiltrate and sabotage Indian airbases. On September 7, 1965, the Special Services Group SSG commandos were parachuted into enemy territory. According to Commander-in-Chief of the Pakistan Army, General Muhammad Musa, about 135 commandos were airdropped at 3 Indian airfields, Halwara, Pathankot, and Adampur. The daring attempt turned out to be an unmitigated disaster. Only 22 commandos returned to Pakistan as planned. 93 were taken prisoner, including one of the commanders of the operations, Major Khalid Butt, and 20 were killed in encounters with the army, police, or civilians. Citation needed. The reason for the failure of the commando mission is attributed to the failure to provide maps, proper briefings, and adequate planning or preparation. Despite failing to sabotage the airfields, Pakistan sources claim that the commando mission affected some planned Indian operations. As the Indian 14th Infantry Division was diverted to hunt for paratroopers, the Pakistan Air Force found the road filled with transport and destroyed many vehicles. India responded to the covert activity by announcing rewards for captured Pakistani spies or paratroopers. Meanwhile, in Pakistan, rumors spread that India had retaliated with its own covert operations, sending commandos deep into Pakistan territory, but these rumors were later determined to be unfounded. Neutral assessments. There have been several neutral assessments of the losses incurred by both India and Pakistan during the war. Most of these assessments agree that India had the upper hand over Pakistan when the ceasefire was declared. Some neutral assessments are mentioned below. According to the Library of Congress Country Studies conducted by the Federal Research Division of the United States, the war was militarily inconclusive. Each side held prisoners and some territory belonging to the other. Losses were relatively heavy in the Pakistani side: 20 aircraft, 200 tanks, and 3,800 troops. Pakistan's army had been able to withstand Indian pressure, but a continuation of the fighting would only have led to further losses and ultimate defeat for Pakistan. Most Pakistanis, schooled in the belief of their own martial prowess, refused to accept the possibility of their country's military defeat by Hindu India and were, instead, quick to blame their failure to attain their military aims on what they considered to be the ineptitude of Ayub Khan and his government. Former New York Times reporter Arif Jamal wrote in his book Shadow War, "This time, India's victory was nearly total. India accepted a ceasefire only after it had occupied 740 square miles, 1900 km2. Though Pakistan had made marginal gains of 210 square miles, 540 km2 of territory. Despite the obvious strength of the Indian win, both countries claimed to have been victorious." Devin T. Haggerty wrote in his book South Asia in World Politics, "The invading Indian forces outfought their Pakistani counterparts and halted their attack on the outskirts of Lahore, Pakistan's second-largest city. By the time the United Nations intervened on September 22, Pakistan had suffered a clear defeat." In his book National Identity and Geopolitical Visions, Gurchan Dijkink writes, "The superior Indian forces, however, won a decisive victory, and the army could have even marched on into Pakistani territory, had external pressure not forced both combatants to cease their war efforts. An excerpt from Stanley Wolpert's India, summarizing the Indo-Pakistani War of 1965. In 3 weeks, the Second Indo-Pak War ended in what appeared to be a draw when the embargo placed by Washington on U.S. ammunition and replacements for both armies forced the cessation of conflict before either side won a clear victory. India, however, was in a position to inflict grave damage to, if not capture, Pakistan's capital of the Punjab, when the ceasefire was called, and controlled Kashmir's strategic Uri Poonch Bulge, much to Ayub's chagrin. In his book titled The Greater Game, India's Race with Destiny and China, David Van Prague wrote, India won the war. It held on to the Vale of Kashmir, the prize Pakistan vainly sought. It gained 1,840 square kilometers 710 sq mi of Pakistani territory, 640 square kilometers 250 sq mi in Azad Kashmir, Pakistan's portion of the state, 460 square kilometers 180 sq mi of the Salkot sector, 380 square kilometers 150 sq mi far to the south of Sindh, and most critical, 360 square kilometers 140 sq mi on the Lahore front. Pakistan took 540 square kilometers 210 sq mi of Indian territory, 490 square kilometers 190 sq mi in the Cham sector, and 50 square kilometers 19 sq mi round Kem Karan. Dennis Cox's India and the United States Estranged Democracies also provides a summary of the war. Although both sides lost heavily in men and material, and neither gained a decisive military advantage, India had the best of the war. New Delhi achieved its basic goal of thwarting Pakistan's attempt to seize Kashmir by force. Pakistan gained nothing from a conflict which it had instigated. A region in turmoil, South Asian conflicts since 1947, by Robert Johnson mentions. India's strategic aims were modest. It aimed to deny the Pakistani army victory. Although it ended up in possession of 720 square miles, 1900 km2, of Pakistani territory for the loss of just 220 square miles, 570 km2 of its own. An excerpt from William M. Carpenter and David G. Wiencheck's Asian Security Handbook, Terrorism and the New Security Environment. A brief, but furious 1965 war with India began with a covert Pakistani thrust across the Kashmiri ceasefire line, and ended up with the city of Lahore threatened with encirclement by the Indian Army. Another unsponsored ceasefire left borders unchanged, but Pakistan's vulnerability had again been exposed. English historian John Keyes' India, A History provides a summary of the 1965 war. The 1965 Indo-Pak War lasted barely a month. Pakistan made gains in the Rajasthan desert, but its main push against India's Jammu-Srinagar road link was repulsed, and Indian tanks advanced to within a sight of Lahore. Both sides claimed victory, but India had most to celebrate. UK Heo and Shail Asher Horowitz write in their book Conflict in Asia, Korea, China, Taiwan, and India-Pakistan. Again, India appeared, logistically at least, to be in a superior position. But neither side was able to mobilize enough strength to gain a decisive victory. According to the Office of the Historian within the U.S. Department of State, conflict resumed again in early 1965, when Pakistani and Indian forces clashed over disputed territory along the border between the two nations. Hostilities intensified that August when the Pakistani army attempted to take Kashmir by force. The attempt to seize the state was unsuccessful, and the Second India-Pakistan War reached a stalemate. Ceasefire. On 20 September, the United Nations Security Council unanimously passed a resolution, which noted that its previous 2 resolutions went unheeded, and now demanded an unconditional ceasefire from both nations within 48 hours. India immediately accepted, while Pakistan accepted it on 23 September, with some notable dramatics. India and Pakistan accused each other of ceasefire violations. India charged Pakistan with 585 violations in 34 days, while Pakistan countered with accusations of 450 incidents by India. In addition to the expected exchange of small arms and artillery fire, India reported that Pakistan utilized the ceasefire to capture the Indian village of Chananwala in the Fazilka sector. This village was recaptured by Indian troops on 25 December. On 10 October, an B-57 Canberra on loan to the PAF was damaged by 3 Sa-2 missiles fired from the IAF base at Ambala. A Pakistani Army Oster AOP was shot down on 16 December, killing 1 Pakistani Army captain. On February 2, 1967, an AOP was shot down by IAF Hawker hunters. The ceasefire remained in effect until the start of the Indo-Pakistani War of 1971. Tashkent Declaration. The United States and the Soviet Union used significant diplomatic tools to prevent any further escalation in the conflict between the two South Asian nations. The Soviet Union, led by Premier Alexei Kosygin, hosted peace negotiations in Tashkent, now in Uzbekistan, where Indian Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri and Pakistani President Muhammad Ayub Khan signed the Tashkent Declaration on January 10, 1966, agreeing to withdraw to pre-August lines no later than February 25, 1966. In India, the agreement was criticized because it did not contain a no-war pact or any renunciation of guerrilla warfare across Kashmir. India's Prime Minister, Shastri, suffered a fatal heart attack soon after the Tashkent Agreement on January 11, 1966. As a consequence, the public outcry in India against the peace declaration transformed into a wave of sympathy for the ruling Indian National Congress. Public perceptions. The ceasefire was criticized by many Pakistanis who, relying on fabricated official reports and the controlled Pakistani press, believed that the leadership had surrendered military gains. The protests led to student riots. Pakistan State's reports had suggested that their military was performing admirably in the war, which they incorrectly blamed as being initiated by India, and thus the Tashkent Declaration was seen as having forfeited the gains. Some recent books written by Pakistani authors, including one by ex-ISI Chief Lieutenant General Mahmud Ahmad Durrani, initially titled The Myth of 1965 Victory, reportedly exposed Pakistani fabrications about the war. But all copies of the book were bought by the Pakistan Army to prevent circulation because the topic was too sensitive. The book was published with the revised title History of Indo-Pak War 1965. Published by Services Book Club, a part of the Pakistan military, and printed by Oxford University Press, Karachi. A few copies of the book have survived. 169 version was published in India as Illusion of Victory, a military history of the Indo-Pak War 1965 by Lexicon Publishers. Recently, a new Pakistani impression has been published in 2017.